Good morning, colleagues, and a very big thank you to the team for inviting me to speak this morning. As we've said, my name is Vanessa Strange and I head up the infrastructure investment team at Lincolnshire County Council. Kat, can you move me on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So with a wide-ranging work experience, I should say that I also have a real passion for all things rural and for a future thinking world. And so today my challenge is really going to be about keeping my feet on the ground and not ranging across the whole agenda. The team have asked me to share a little of our experience in terms of dealing with COVID-19 in a very rural county running a significant DRT operation. So we're going to start off with a brief introduction to Lincolnshire and then think a little bit about some of the data and the story that tells us from the last few months in terms of the numbers around transport usage across the country and across Lincolnshire, and also to reflect a little about where that tells us we're going in terms of transport policy and our wider thinking. So looking at that slide up there, we've got a picture of Greater Lincolnshire. Actually, we've snuck in North and North East Lincolnshire, my colleagues at the top of the map there, but you can see we're a big rural county, and in terms of the demography figures, they're really pretty sparse, just one person per hectare, with around a third of people living in communities of less than 3,000 people. And car ownership at 75%. So wouldn't be fair to not do our bit of advert for Lincolnshire PLC. So in terms of a place to live or to visit, an absolutely amazing county to be in, even if the broadband's a bit wobbly at times. So if I disappear, apologies. But we are famous for everything from plum bread to sausages to fabulous country homes, Lincoln Castle standing next to the finest cathedral in the country. So all wonderful, but actually a really challenging space to operate rural transport provision and mass transit options. Next slide, please. Thank you. And it's that challenge really that made us reflect some years ago now about the sort of services that we saw or were seeing. We've just heard about that sort of decline right back from the 1980s in terms of bus use nationally. And the same was true in Lincolnshire, and really a decision was taken that we needed to do something more creative to make sure that we still provided that essential connectivity for Lincolnshire people. So on that map, we can see in blue are interurban bus services, largely commercial, connecting our market towns and the city of Lincoln. In green, we can see the rail network as well. And to support that network, we came up with the solution of using a demand responsive model. Next slide, please, Kat. And for us, our model is known as Call Connect, and it is that DRT solution, which really supports the whole network and gives a really high level of accessibility for our customers. Operating a mixed-size fleet of, I think, 31 vehicles now, and really demand-led at its heart. Next slide, please. And there we are, one of our minibuses, and we're carrying around 350,000 passengers in a normal year, and operating a 6-day-a-week service. And the service provision really varies. I'm sure people are expecting there's a lot of kind of social journeys, health journeys, but also we have quite a few young people travelling on those services as well. We also do some home to school services too. Next slide, please. And I suppose for me, there's something about, in my world, thinking about continual improvement and where we're going with policy and strategy. And actually doing this presentation has really given me a chance to reflect on where we were pre-2020. And looking back over sort of 12 months ago, when the world seemed perhaps a simpler place, even though we didn't know it at the time, we were very much trying to think about our transport planning in a wider policy space. And as an authority, thinking about where we're going. For some time, we'd been pursuing total transport as a goal, a concept of working transport assets to their maximum, really, across the public sector. For us, very much looking to partner with the NHS and really for it to not matter what journey type people were making, whether it was being paid for by the NHS, a concessionary fare pass, or by the passenger themselves. And I think for many years we've been partially successful, I think, in terms of trials, partial victories, but we also started to realise that we needed to think about the future of transport in terms of connectivity, think about digital as a space itself, and really to move some of that thinking forward. For us, that meant being part of a kind of future thinking process for the whole authority, really. So that was everything from digital roadmaps for adult social care to thinking about heat networks or indeed future movement, encapsulating kind of that whole space of micro-mobility to decarbonisation. And I think the appetite for that future thinking really meant that we were well positioned to work with Midlands Connect in terms of the future of rural mobility piece, which you'll hear more from Gary about later. Really, it's aligned so well for us, because for us, DRT is so close to a mobility as a service type model that those sort of flexibilities feel like a natural progression. So how could we use something like MAS combined with potentially mobility hubs to really bring about sort of flexibility and the kind of integration around spatial planning that we might need. And this learning was all sort of lined up to work into our 5th local transport plan. And next slide, please, actually. And I suppose many of us think about a range of grand challenges when we're doing this work, and I've put a few up there in terms of the sorts of things that we're all thinking about all of the time, in terms of trying to find the solutions that manage some of those challenges, whether it's around managing economic growth and climate change, making sure that for our passengers there's safety and security, but also things like quality of life. I think it's really easy sometimes to think that rural bus use is a very small part of the pie, but actually the difference that it can make to people who would be otherwise excluded from so much of life if they didn't have that level of access and provision. And next slide, please, Kat. And thinking about that really in terms of that future thinking piece, I often reflect that actually if we really get future thinking and we think about, you know, we get to a space of driverless cars and mobility that we don't own, actually that could open up somebody's world in a rural space, somebody who doesn't currently drive for whatever reason. Actually, maybe a vehicle could just appear at your door. And it's those kind of bold thoughts that we then need to combine with the reality of the here and now, I suppose. Next slide, please. And as 2020 arrived, suddenly what we thought was a challenge, and we'd thought about disruption, it turned out that there was a form of disruption that we could never have anticipated. And suddenly we became very reactive, I suppose, in the service provision that we were looking to keep going. But we were also thinking very much about a somewhat overused phrase, perhaps, of what the new normal might look like. For very many of us on this call today will be have experienced the joys of working from home, but also the kind of acceptance and adoption of technology. I'll reflect on ourselves as an organisation who moved from a point where we were having to either have access to the network in the morning or the afternoon, dependent on what your surname, where your surname sat in the alphabet, to a space where we were all kind of using Teams fairly comfortably within a couple of weeks. It was a huge push in terms of that technology piece. Cultural and societal change, I think, you know, we've perhaps all started to evaluate what has been good about being at home more or what has been different. But I think if we just spend a little bit of time thinking about the disruption to travel norms. Can we have the next slide, please, Kat? So many of you will have seen slides like this and been thinking about what has happened to our journey types over the last few months. And I think it's worth just dwelling on the numbers for a little while, and particularly if we think about those different modes. And many of us will be aware that sort of light good vehicles and HGVs are back to pre-COVID levels, and in some places above pre-COVID levels now. And car use in September, October was around 90% of what we would normally expect. The positive in that is the cycling and walking trips, which are something like 20% higher. But for me, the real concerns sit around local bus and rail use, and particularly for today, we'll focus on the bus side, which looks at having returned to something like 60% of COVID levels at best. Inevitably, people are moving around less than they were, and feeling that they wish to use car where they can. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we get people back really into that space. And during May, Transport Focus carried out some work to understand public transport users' perceptions. And when asked when they will use public transport again, almost a third of the respondents stated that they would only use it when they felt safe. Now, many of us know that encouraging people to get on the bus, to make that modal shift, is a really difficult challenge at the very best of times. That unconscious bias that the public may have around bus usage has become extremely conscious over the last 9 months. Essentially, we've had government public health campaign connecting catching the bus with catching COVID. Next slide, please. And when I look at the figures closer to home, certainly Lincolnshire figures pretty much mirror overall the trend across the country. Where there is some interest for us, though, if we look at the next slide, sorry, Kat, is around our Call Connect journeys. And Lincolnshire's demand responsive transport tells a slightly different story. It appears that patronage has returned much closer to pre-COVID levels than our broader bus patronage. This slide shows the total number of trips between February and October, and we got to 80% of pre-COVID levels in mid-October. Next slide, please. So we're currently undertaking some analysis to understand those differences, really to think about why we're seeing different trends in terms of our DRT services compared to our normal commercial traditional services, if you like. Is there something about levels of trust? Is there something about perceptions of safety? Or is it in honesty just the lack of other options? So, of course, people travel for many different reasons, and many of us will have been thinking about the impact on some of those journey choices as well, in terms of what might happen to our network going forward. Working from home is clearly a very big impact in terms of commuter traffic. And the Chartered Institute of Personal Development carried out some survey work with employers during June about their intentions for regular home working. And worth reflecting that they expected to see, or reported expectations of an increase to 37% of workforce compared to 18% pre-COVID working from home, which is obviously a huge shift. Evidently, increases in unemployment will also have a major impact on travel. In terms of education, in Lincolnshire and in our neighbouring authorities, we've seen a reduction in scholars' passes this year. Is this a short-term blip, perhaps, in terms of confidence in the network? But we've also seen a shift in number of students travelling. And there is a question about whether more virtual learning may become more commonplace in the future. In terms of shopping and the high street, I think many people recognise that the high street was in a challenging place, or many high streets were in a challenging place pre-COVID. And really, COVID has perhaps supercharged the need for us to repurpose the high street in many locations. And perhaps we need to think in tandem about kind of our urban movement, consider the rise of the white van and what that might mean for our urban spaces. In terms of health, the NHS is, before COVID, has a plan in place around digital provision, and their longer term planning is very much about encouraging and enabling opportunities to connect digitally, both in terms of as another option in terms of face-to-face, but also in terms of that self-testing and self-monitoring piece, wearable technology. I was interested to see a piece in the summer about the fitting of a spirometer for cystic fibrosis patients, which meant that they could self-monitor at home rather than having to have frequent visits to their GP. And it's these kind of trends which will really impact on movement going forward. In terms of leisure, really interesting and unknown sort of space about how we may all behave in terms of our longer term behaviours. If we do repurpose our high streets, will we all be happy to go back there to spend our dwell time? Do we want to move about differently? Perhaps if we're working from home more, we'll all have the urge to actually physically see people a little more than we do now. And what might that do to the traditional peak in travel and the way that we provide services? Next slide, please. So it's been great to hear this morning from the DFT about the government response to the pandemic. And I think we can see some really positive messages from this morning's earlier presentation, particularly great news in terms of cycling and walking and the active travel fund that many of our authorities will be benefiting from. And in terms of rail as well, I think there's been some opportunities there despite the hugely challenging numbers that they're faced with at the moment. We talked there a little bit about regulation in the question session. And for me, there's certainly something very interesting about the move away from the franchise model that's been announced. Obviously, we're waiting for the detail, but it seems like a very significant shift and a very different position to where we were in March 2020. For me, the bus industry has not had the same level of radical overhaul, and perhaps we need to think about whether it's now time to do that. Funding packages have undoubtedly been at an unprecedented level for local authorities and operators who have in turn have opened their books to the DFT. And it would be really interesting to have a window into Jamie's world, wouldn't it, and understand what that thinking is. But for me, it's worth reflecting on the fact that commercial operators, particularly in rural spaces, were in a very difficult position pre-COVID. I was trying to marry our ambitions around carbon and about future mobility with the reality of being a local bus operator. And it can be quite difficult to talk to people about the need to look at alternative options, whether it be electric, hydrogen, for the future, when they have no capex available to invest in their business. So there is certainly a need for government strategy, but there is also something about government investment. A better deal for bus users, it also needs to be a better deal for the industry too. And we will need to go much further. Investment will need to be part of the jigsaw, but in rural spaces, we need greater regulatory flexibility too. Perhaps around the lines between commercial and supported services, should regulation or indeed deregulation be on the agenda, or at least a flexible approach to enable us to use taxes in the operation as we move towards mobility as a service. In a very practical and immediate space, the County Council will need to support bus services to ensure that they do operate and provide the essential services that our residents need. One of the limitations that the Council has at this present time is the limit of 25% of total supported bus budget that can be spent on de minimis contracts. And the Council is already close to that limit, which leaves very little scope to support services in an ad hoc way in the future. Could we temporarily or permanently change this 25% limit? And what is the flexibility to move to make a bus network fit for the future? Next slide, please, Kat. So in conclusion, I do think that we have a greater understanding of needs to maximise integration, connectivity and future modes. We will need to be really creative in our approach to get people back to public transport, and this will require a major national and local investment. One thing I think many of us have learned in the last 12 months is the importance of place and the environment that we live in. Our networks cannot sustain, nor can our climate sustain, an increase in car usage. And the only way to address this is to really think about all of our modes in the round. So we will all need to be very creative and committed to the medium and long-term goals. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vanessa. That was brilliant. Some really useful information there about the work that's going on in Lincolnshire. And it's really great to see a service up and running in a rural area that's responded to rural need, because there's probably many people here that have lost bus services, you know, and are quite isolated and worried about their transport options, especially now during COVID when a lot of services have gone. So thank you very much for that. We've got some questions in the Q&A for you. So to the audience, if you're there, if you've got a question, pop it in. If you like any of these questions, if you vote on them, and they will rise to the top, and we'll get through as many as we can before we go to the networking break. Okay, so just going to the top. I've put a question in, sorry. People like it. So the first one was, what would be your advice to other local authorities that are considering this model of DRT rural bus services?
Well, I think I would say get in touch. We normally host lots of visits. We're really keen on that, but actually we can do a lot of that virtually now. I think there's something about understanding kind of customer needs, but actually for many rural areas, DRT is a really strong option. I think, as I tried to allude to, I think, you know, we need to move from a kind of DRT that we've been operating for some time into a even more kind of flexible approach where we're thinking about all modes and much more about mobility as a service. But yes, get in touch and come and have a look is what I would say, and we'll talk you through a bit more of the numbers and what that might mean for your authority.
You'll have a mass visit when we can all come. That's
fine. Well, probably we can do that now, can't we? If the broadband holds up.
Okay, the next question's from Phil Jones. Will the move, will the move to working from home reduce the need for commuting and hence further impact the viability of bus services? You did mention that, didn't you?
Yeah. I think that's a huge challenge for us all, isn't it? Is the unintended consequence. So I've spent years of my life, as have many other people here today, sort of thinking about almost access to services and enabling that piece, but also we've been talking about reducing the need to travel. I don't think we've quite understood this kind of level of impact. So when we've talked about reducing the need to travel, we've mainly probably been thinking about car use. We've maybe not been thinking what would happen if you took away a whole chunk of people who are using the local bus operation, and what might that mean in terms of numbers. I think a lot of our operations are, where they are commercial, are operating on a bit of a knife edge. And I think a huge challenge for the DFT and for the Treasury is at what point do they remove the massive amount of support that is currently being pumped into the networks, and the conversation that will need to happen between operators, local authorities, the department, about what do we do to wean people off the subsidy, but also then what happens with if the network falls over, because as we all appreciate, actually we have a huge transport budget, but it mops up and supports so many other areas, even of my own organisation. So from adult social care to public health, the connections are so strong. Sorry, Vicky, I could talk all day on
no, that's
subjects.
Good. I think that's what people are here for. That they want to hear your thoughts on this, because you're delivering a service. You're the one, your organisation is delivering that service. So yeah, it's really interesting. So there's another question here from Dr. Steve Bristow. A very important comment from Vanessa. Essentially, we've had the government's public health campaign seeing public transport use as COVID risk, or words to that effect. Is it time for the government to rebalance?
And I think that's an almost impossible question for me to answer, because I also sit alongside public health colleagues in my organisation for whom lots of very difficult decisions have been made that have impacted on the economy, and for very logical reasons. I suppose my comment is, as somebody who is particularly looking through a particular lens in terms of the impact on local bus usage, and I think it is going to take a huge amount of effort to unpick some of that messaging, really. I think many of us have tried over the years to get away from some of the images of what bus users look like or what buses are like, and anyone who goes out and surveys kind of a chunk of residents, whether it's in Lincolnshire or Herefordshire or other rural places, you are asking people who may never have been on a bus in their entire life what a bus looks like, or they've not been on the bus since they're at university or something like that. And their perceptions are that they're sort of old and cronky, smelly, they don't want to sit next to the person who's going to be on there. Ironically, these are probably people who commute to London, Leeds, wherever on a daily basis using rail. The perceptions that are attached to the bus network are really difficult anyway. And it really concerns me how we start to make it a positive experience for people. Obviously, at this point in time, we're still in a space where we don't really want to be pushing people back into bus world for public health reasons. I suppose my hope is that as much investment and effort goes into positive messaging when the time comes, as we've had for the last 9 months about don't use the bus. So if we, I am reassured by colleagues at DFT that they will be helping us with that. So they are very good in terms of working with local authorities. Many of us sit on a weekly call, and it is a very regular conversation that we have. So they have heard it many times.
In a way, that sort of answers Alan's question as well about how do we communicate around COVID risk and transport. So I will take that one off. And if I've got another question, but I'll come to Gerard's question now. How are we supporting alternative energies, e.g. hydrogen fuel stations, electric power points? Is that something that you are, projects that you've got involved with in Lincolnshire?
Yeah, so I think for me, that's a really interesting example of why you need to have transport planning at its sort of highest level, sat alongside that infrastructure piece. So many local authorities will be involved in infrastructure planning alongside their LEPs. And things like hydrogen can, or whatever technology agnostic statement we want to make, but whatever we end up sort of going for, we are not going to achieve in a piecemeal approach. So there's something about planning at a really spatial level for that for me, and even at a regional level. So certainly I'm working with colleagues at Midlands Connect on decarbonisation, both around sort of the EV side, but also what do those larger vehicles look like? Because certainly in a county like Lincolnshire, electric probably is not going to be the only solution. Despite many myths, we are not an entirely flat county. We actually have quite a lot of hills, and a challenging run out to the coast for an electric bus, I would suggest, from Lincoln. So planning at a spatial level is really important. I think also looking at opportunities. So northeast Lincolnshire have a huge amount of industry on the banks of the Humber there. We've also got a coastline. Thinking about the whole circular economy piece, which I know people will be very interested in terms of that carbon agenda. How can we use kind of other people's waste as well to be part of our solution? I think has to be that whole systems thinking piece.
I'm just laughing because that's completely up Juliana's. Juliana's smiling now because that's your favourite topic, isn't it, Juliana?
We're trying. Early days in Lincolnshire, but we are trying. We'll know where to come now,
yeah, you know where to come. I will ask one last question, Vanessa. So there's one from Caroline Taylor. North East Links is a unitary authority. Can you explain why two authorities joined to undertake this work? How did it work?
So we run some of the services in North Lincolnshire and have close working relationships with both unitaries, and it is an interesting discussion actually, because I was on a call only yesterday talking about such things, that we have political boundaries which mean very little to passengers. Nobody wants to be able to have to get off a service because they hit a county boundary. So in terms of those interconnect routes, those main kind of interurban areas, we've got to be working with commercial operators to be able to help that journey happen, whether it's Lincoln up to Grimsby or up to Scunthorpe for those eagle-eyed map viewers earlier. But I think the same could be said for electric vehicle charging. We've got to think in a bigger sense, really, than just our own kind of political space. We gain so much from working with the likes of Midlands Connect. North and North East Lincolnshire are sat with Transport for the North, and that starts to tell you another challenge of when you start to slice up the country, there is no ideal solution, is there? So at a really local level, we just have to keep having those conversations. I should also make an advert for any local authorities who are interested. We do run DRT for a number of other local authorities. That is also an option. I have to do my well-rounded advertising campaign.
That's how you make transport sustainable in Lincolnshire. Thank you very much, Vanessa. I haven't managed to get quite through all the questions, but I will keep a copy of them and share them with you if you would like to respond via email. Thank you very much. And I'll hand back over to Juliana.
Okay, super. Thank you ever so much, Vanessa. Great responses to all the questions from the participants today. Thank you also, participants, for the questions. Thank you for sharing Lincolnshire's current situation and future vision, Vanessa. It's great to hear about it. I really like your model for DRT. It made me smile actually, because you carry 1 million passengers, I think you said, around a year. Sorry, no, you've got 1 million in your population. You carry 350,000 passengers. Well, actually, our population in Shropshire is only 350,000. So I started to think, actually, would DRT be viable for us here in a county? I don't know, but it'd be great to speak to you more to learn more about that going forward. So thank you once again, Vanessa. Great presentation. And also thank you very much to Jamie again for his earlier presentation. We're going to take about a 20-minute break now. We'll restart at 11:20. So please go and grab a tea and coffee. Continue with your questions, please, within the Q&A panel on the right-hand side. And also don't forget you can network with colleagues as well by sending them a private message and going elsewhere within the remote platform today. So we shall look forward to welcoming you back at 11:20. Thanks very much.